He divorced his quiet wife. Then 12 black Rolls-Royces arrived to take her home. He slid the papers across the marble table like they were a dinner check. No raised voice, no explanation. 7 years of marriage, and Adrienne Voss reduced it to a manila folder and a ballpoint pen placed beside her coffee cup. Lena Marlowe looked at the papers. She looked at the pen. Then she looked at the man she had loved since she was 26 years old. The man whose enemies she had quietly neutralized, whose business she had silently shielded, whose life she had held together with both hands while he mistook her calm for weakness. She picked up the pen. She signed. Adrienne watched her do it, and something crossed his face. Not guilt, not hesitation. Impatience. Like he had expected the process to take longer and was relieved it hadn't. "You'll understand why I stayed silent," Lena said, capping the pen and setting it back beside the coffee cup with careful precision. "When the truth arrives." He said nothing. She stood, walked to the bedroom, packed one suitcase, not the large one, the carry-on, and left through the front door without looking back. 4 hours later, 12 black Rolls-Royces turned onto Hargrove Avenue in a slow, deliberate procession that stopped traffic in both directions. And nothing in Adrienne Voss's life was ever the same again. Well, if a story like this hits different, if you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, because I promise you every episode gets heavier than the last. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Well, the rain had been falling since morning, not the dramatic kind that announces itself, but the slow, persistent kind that soaks through everything before you notice you're wet. Lena stood at the kitchen window of the Whitmore estate, watching it streak down the glass in crooked lines, and she thought about patience. She had been patient for 7 years. She had been patient the first time Adrienne came home with another woman's perfume on his collar and looked her in the eye and said nothing, daring her to make it a problem. She had been patient when his lieutenants talked over her at the dinner table, when his mother called her "that quiet little thing" at the family Christmas gathering, when his attorney had looked directly past her to address Adrienne about the estate documents she herself had drafted. Patience, her grandmother used to say, is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision to feel everything and still refuse to be moved before the right moment. Lena had been waiting for the right moment for a long time. She heard Adrienne's footsteps before she saw him. A particular rhythm she had memorized the way other people memorize music, because in this house you needed to know what kind of mood was walking toward you before it arrived. These steps were measured, deliberate, the steps of a man who had already made a decision and was arriving to deliver it, not discuss it. She turned from the window. He was wearing the gray suit, the one he wore to meetings where someone was going to lose something. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Lena." "Adrienne." She kept her voice level. Not cold. Level. There was a difference, and she'd spent years making sure people understood which one they were getting. He set the folder on the table, slid it toward her. She already knew what it was before she opened it. She had known for 3 weeks, because she had sources inside his attorney's office that Adrienne had no idea existed, and she had known the moment the paperwork was drawn up. She had used those 3 weeks wisely. "This is what you want," she said. Not a question. "It's the right move for both of us." She almost laughed at that. Both of us. As if this were a mutual business decision. As if she had been consulted. As if the man sitting across from her, who had never once in 7 years asked her what she wanted for her own life, had suddenly discovered a concern for her well-being at the exact moment it benefited him to be free of her. "Who told you to do this?" she asked. His eyes sharpened. "Nobody told me anything." "Someone always tells you something, Adrienne. You're a brilliant operator, but you've never had an original feeling in your life. You feel what your circle tells you to feel." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. He pushed back his chair. "I'm not going to sit here and sign the papers. Or be honest." She tilted her head slightly. "Because I'll do the first one. I'm not sure you're capable of the second." He stood up. When Adrienne Voss stood up in the middle of a conversation, it meant he was done talking. It was a power move he'd used for years, the physical implication that he controlled whether a scene continued or ended. Lena had never once responded to it the way he expected. She sat down, pulled the folder toward her, and read every page. All 14 of them. He stood there for the entire 8 minutes it took, and she could feel the frustration radiating off him like heat from a radiator. The particular frustration of a man who had prepared for a fight and been denied one. She signed on every marked line, initialed where required, closed the folder, slid it back. "Done," she said. "That's it? What were you expecting?" He was expecting tears. She knew that. She had seen the way he'd steeled himself walking in, the set of his shoulders, the careful blankness of his expression, the armor a man puts on when he anticipates emotion he doesn't know how to manage. He had come in here ready to be unmoved by her grief, and now he didn't know what to do with her composure. "I expected—" He stopped. "You expected me to make this difficult." She stood. "I know. I've spent 7 years making things easy for you, so I understand why you'd think I'd stop now." She smoothed the front of her blouse. "I won't. I'm leaving tonight. The house is yours. The accounts you know about are yours. The rest was never yours to begin with." Something in those last words caught him. She saw it, a flicker of something uncertain moving behind his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what I said." She picked up her coffee cup, carried it to the sink, rinsed it. A completely ordinary gesture in a completely demolished marriage. "You'll understand when the truth arrives." She left him standing there holding a signed divorce agreement and a sentence he wouldn't be able to stop turning over for the next 4 hours. The suitcase she packed was a charcoal gray carry-on, medium quality, unremarkable. She had owned it for 12 years and chosen it deliberately tonight over the luggage Adrian had bought her, matched Italian leather sets that cost more than most people's cars. She didn't want anything from him, not even the containers. She moved through the bedroom methodically, clothes she had owned before the marriage, the small rosewood box from her grandmother, 2 hard drives she had kept in the false bottom of a hat box in the back of the closet. Adrian had never looked there, had never looked anywhere in this room except the surface of things. A passport in her name that predated the marriage by 4 years. A burner phone, charged and waiting. She was not improvising. She had not packed this way tonight because of some sudden decision to leave with dignity. She had packed this way because she had known this moment was coming, had planned for it, had prepared her exit the way a serious person prepares anything important, quietly, carefully, and long in advance. The front door closed behind her at 9:47 p.m. She did not look back. Marcus Webb had been Adrian Voss's head of security for 9 years, which meant he had seen things that would empty out a lesser man's sleep permanently. He had watched Adrian negotiate at gunpoint, watched him absorb betrayal with a stillness that was genuinely frightening, watched him dismantle 3 rival organizations with a patience and precision that Marcus privately found more unsettling than any open violence. But when Marcus called his boss at 10:13 p.m. on a Tuesday night to report that 12 black Rolls-Royces had just turned onto Hargrove Avenue in a convoy formation, moving slowly and deliberately toward the Whitmore estate, when he said that into the phone and heard the silence on the other end, Marcus Webb felt, for the first time in 9 years, that Adrian Voss was genuinely caught off guard. "How many?" Adrian said. 12. Black. No plates visible. They've been covered. The lead vehicle has a flag pennant, sir. I can't make out the emblem." "Where's Lena?" "That's the thing." Marcus paused, because this next part was going to require a moment of processing. "I think they're here for her." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Hold position," Adrian said. "Nobody moves until I'm outside." He came out the front door in 60 seconds. No jacket, shirt sleeves, the divorce folder still in his hand. He'd apparently been standing in the foyer when the call came. Marcus watched him take in the convoy with those flat, calculating eyes that never betrayed panic, but never entirely hid awareness either. The lead Rolls-Royce stopped. The rear door opened. A man stepped out. Mid-50s, silver-haired, built like someone who had been strong in his 30s and had simply decided to stay that way. He wore a black suit that had been cut specifically for his body. He walked toward Lena, who was standing on the driveway with her carry-on beside her, as if she had known exactly when to come outside. And he stopped about 3 feet from her and lowered his head in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but was absolutely a mark of deference. "Ms. Marlowe," he said, "your family sends their respect. We've been waiting." Lena nodded once. "Tell them I'm ready." She turned to look at Adrian then, just once, a single glance over her shoulder. Not cruel, not triumphant. The look of someone who had tried to warn a person and had accepted they wouldn't listen. Then she got into the car. The convoy moved. Marcus looked at his boss. Adrian was staring at the tail end of the procession as it turned off Hargrove Avenue and disappeared into the rain, and his expression was doing something Marcus had never seen it do before. It was doing nothing, absolute blank, stunned nothing. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "do you want to know what I can find out about those plates?" Adrian didn't answer for a long moment. "Find out everything," he said finally. "Every single thing." The name Marlowe meant nothing to Adrian the next morning. It meant nothing to his attorney. It meant nothing to his 3 senior lieutenants when he put the question to them over black coffee in the East Conference Room with the rain still going outside. Then it meant something to one of them. Donovan Reese was the oldest of Adrian's inner circle, 61, white-haired, meticulous, the man who handled the financial architecture of everything Adrian's organization touched. He had been with Adrian's father before he was with Adrian, and he carried that history in his posture, a slight stiffness of the spine that came from decades of rooms where speaking incorrectly cost you something permanent. When Adrian said the name Marlowe and described the convoy, Donovan went very still. Not the stillness of someone who didn't know something, the stillness of someone deciding how much of what they knew they were willing to share. "Donovan," Adrian said. "I've heard the name," Donovan said. "How?" A pause. "Your father mentioned it once, years ago, in a context I didn't fully understand at the time." Adrian leaned forward. "What context?" "He said," Donovan set down his coffee cup. "He said that if you ever encountered the Marlowe name in a serious way, you should understand that they were the kind of people who don't arrive unless they've already determined the outcome." He looked at Adrian directly. He said they were not like us. He said they were the people that people like us don't see coming. The room went quiet. "My wife," Adrian said slowly, "was a Marlowe." Nobody spoke. "And none of you knew." More silence. The particular silence of a room full of people in the business of knowing things, realizing they had catastrophically not known something. "I want her background," Adrian said. "Full history. Who she was before I met her. I want to know everything, and I want it before this room empties." Marcus was already on his phone. What they found over the next 6 hours rearranged Adrian's understanding of the last 7 years so completely that he had to sit with it for a long time before he could make himself continue reading. Lena Marlowe, born Elena Simone Marlowe, 33 years old, was the only daughter of the late Conrad Marlowe, founder of what was known in certain circles as the Marlowe Alliance. Not a crime organization in the traditional sense, not a cartel, not a syndicate, not any of the structures Adrian understood. The alliance operated in the spaces between visible power, intelligence brokerage, financial negotiation, the kind of quiet institutional influence that took generations to build and could not be dismantled by force because it had no single center to strike. Conrad Marlowe had died 4 years before Lena met Adrian. He had left his daughter as his designated successor, and then, for reasons that took Marcus's team 3 hours to begin to unravel, she had walked away from it. She had not run from it. She had not been removed. She had walked away, deliberately, and gone quiet, changed her public profile, simplified her life, and eventually married a Mafia boss who everyone in her previous world must have considered a significant step down. "Why?" Adrian said, reading the file. Marcus looked at him. "We don't know yet. That's the only question that matters right now, so figure it out." But even before the answer came, and it would come in pieces over the next several days, each piece worse than the last, something else was landing in Adrian's chest with a weight he hadn't anticipated. 7 years. 7 years of standing beside her at his meetings, quiet, attentive, the woman everyone talked past. 7 years of watching his associates look right through her. 7 years of him treating her like furniture that occasionally handed him useful information. The woman he had handed divorce papers to last night was the designated heir of one of the most influential shadow organizations in the Western Hemisphere. She had signed the papers without an argument, packed one suitcase, and walked out into the rain to wait for 12 Rolls-Royces she had apparently called herself. And all she had said to him, all she had offered, after 7 years, was 4 words: "When the truth arrives." Adrian sat alone in the East conference room for 40 minutes after the others filed out. The file open in front of him, the rain still streaking down the windows, and the silence of a man who was beginning to understand, with the particular sick clarity of real self-knowledge, that he had made an enormous mistake. Not the divorce. He could have recovered from the divorce. He had made the mistake 3 years before the divorce and 5 years before it, and probably from the very first week of their marriage. The mistake of deciding he already knew who she was, and therefore never bothering to look again. The 12 Royces had not come to retrieve a quiet, powerless woman. They had come to retrieve the one person in his life who had, without his knowledge or his gratitude, been standing between him and his enemies the entire time, and he had handed her a pen and told her to sign. His phone buzzed. Marcus. You need to see this. It's about the attack on the Rotterdam accounts. It was prevented 3 years ago, and it wasn't our people who stopped it. Adrian looked at the message for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus back. Tell me everything, he said. Sir, Marcus said carefully, you might want to be sitting down for this part. Adrian looked out the window at the rain. I'm sitting, he said. He wasn't, but he would be. The Rotterdam file was 43 pages long, and Marcus had printed all of it. He laid it on the conference table in front of Adrian at 2:17 in the morning, and neither of them sat down. They stood over it the way men stand over something they're not sure they want to touch. Like the paper itself carried weight. Like picking it up would make whatever was inside it permanently real. Walk me through it, Adrian said. Marcus pointed to the first page. 3 years ago, November. Someone moved against our Rotterdam accounts. Not a direct hit, a structural play. They were going to use a shell company registered in Luxembourg to trigger a regulatory audit that would have exposed the holding structure. If that audit had gone through, we were looking at asset seizure across 4 countries. I know about that audit, Adrian said. It was dropped. I assumed our attorneys handled it. Our attorneys filed the right paperwork, but the audit was dropped because someone reached out to the regulatory board chair privately and delivered information that redirected their attention to a competing entity. Marcus paused. That entity happened to be the front company of a man who had been trying to squeeze us for 2 years. Adrian looked at him. We benefited twice, Marcus said. The audit disappeared and a problem we hadn't figured out how to solve quietly solved itself. He let that sit for one beat. Our legal team didn't do that. They don't have those connections. I went back and traced every contact that regulatory chair had in that 6-week window before the audit was dropped. And? The contact came through a private intermediary. Untraceable, almost. Whoever set it up used 3 separate communication layers and a cutout firm in Geneva that doesn't exist anymore. Marcus looked at him steadily. But the cutout firm's registered agent, before it dissolved, had one disclosed connection. A consulting entity out of London, dormant for years. He turned to page 11. Registered originally under the name Simone Conrad Consulting. Adrian stared at the name. Simone. Conrad. Lena's middle name and her father's first name stitched together into a company name that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She did this, Adrian said. I believe so. 3 years ago. 3 years ago. And I don't think it was the only time. Adrian pulled the chair out and sat down. Not because he'd planned to. His legs made the decision. How many times? He said. Marcus turned to the index he'd made at the back of the document. 8 incidents. 8 separate occasions over 6 years where something that should have damaged Adrian's organization had been quietly redirected, neutralized, or dissolved before it reached him. 8 times when Adrian had attributed the good outcome to his own strategy, his own people, his own operational excellence. 8 times that Lena had apparently been working in the negative space around his life, removing threats he didn't know existed, using connections he didn't know she had, and walking back into the kitchen to pour his coffee afterward without mentioning any of it. Why? Adrian said, and it came out low and rough in a way he hadn't intended. I don't know, Marcus said. That's the part I can't answer. She wasn't protecting her own interests. She had enough resources to just leave. She could have left any time. She had 12 cars and an entire apparatus waiting for her. She stayed, and she protected mine. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Why? Marcus didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer in the 43 pages, and they both knew it. Find out who pushed the divorce, Adrian said after a moment. You said yesterday you had a thread. I have more than a thread now, Seb. It started with Donovan. Not Donovan himself. That was what made it almost elegant, in a way that Adrian would have appreciated if it hadn't been directed at him. It was Donovan's assistant, a 29-year-old named Philip Greer, who had been with the organization for 4 years and had, at some point in the last 18 months, started having conversations he shouldn't have been having with a man named Carter Blaine. Carter Blaine ran the Blaine Group, which was nominally a private equity firm and actually the financial front for the Solano family's Eastern operations. The Solanos had been circling Adrian's organization for 3 years, looking for a crack. Philip Greer had given them one. Not information, not directly. What Philip had given them, over a series of conversations at restaurants that weren't in his usual radius, was a profile. A behavioral profile of Adrian Voss. What scared him, what flattered him, what made him feel undermined, what made him distrust people he should trust, what made him feel weak without knowing why. And somewhere in that profile, someone had identified Lena, not as a threat, not as an asset, as a psychological lever. The theory, and Marcus laid it out quietly, without editorial, because he'd had time on the drive over to decide that his job right now was information delivery, not interpretation, was that someone had spent a year carefully feeding Adrian's existing insecurities about his marriage. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, no fabricated evidence, just small things. A remark here, a question there, comments from Donovan during private moments that planted seeds Adrian didn't realize were planted. She never really integrated, did she? Must be strange for her, not having her own world. You ever notice how she goes quiet in certain conversations? Like she's waiting for something. Each of those remarks, Marcus confirmed, had been made by Donovan in the 6 months before Adrian initiated the divorce proceedings. Each one had been preceded within 48 hours by a meeting between Philip Greer and Carter Blaine. Donovan was being fed lines, and either he knew it or he'd been manipulated too. Which is it? Adrian said. I think he knew some of it, Marcus said carefully. I think he told himself it was for your benefit, that he was helping you see something real. A pause. I think Donovan has always believed Lena was a liability. He didn't need much encouragement to say things he half believed anyway. Adrian absorbed that. He used Donovan's own bias as the delivery mechanism. Yes. Efficient. Very. Adrian stood up and walked to the window. Dawn was starting, a thin gray line appearing over the city skyline. Not enough to be hopeful about, just enough to make the dark look temporary. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered himself being. Donovan's gone, he said. I figured. Not yet. Not until I know the full shape of this. I need him where I can see him while we work out what he actually passed and what he doesn't know he passed. He turned from the window. And Philip Greer is done as of this morning. Make it clean. I don't want theater. Understood. Get me a line to Carter Blaine. Don't tell him why. Tell him I want a conversation about some routing concerns in the Eastern Corridor accounts. Something he'll believe, something that makes him feel like he has leverage. Adrian's jaw tightened. I want him in a room where he thinks he's ahead. Marcus made a note. And Lena? The question dropped into the room and sat there. I need to know where she is, Adrian said. But I'm not sending anyone to her. Not yet. Not like this. He shook his head. If I reach out right now, she'll think I'm only reaching out because I need something. Aren't you? Marcus asked, and then looked like he wished he hadn't. But Adrian didn't react with anger. He just said quietly, yes. And that's the problem. Lena had been at the Marlowe estate for 2 days before she allowed herself to exhale. The estate, formerly called Harrowwood, though nobody in the family had used that name in 20 years, sat outside the city on 40 acres of property that looked, from the road, like a closed-down agricultural concern. The exterior was deliberately unremarkable. The interior was a different conversation entirely. She sat in the East Library on the second morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a stack of intelligence summaries that had been waiting for her return for 7 years. The people who had compiled them, 3 analysts she had recruited herself before she walked away, sat in a row across the reading table, quiet and professional, waiting for her to finish reading at whatever pace she needed. She had trained them well. They knew not to rush her. The summaries covered the period of her absence, 7 years of events she had tracked from a distance, through the narrow channels she'd maintained in secret while living in Adrian's house. There was more here than she'd been able to gather on her own. There were gaps filled in, connections made visible that had been invisible from where she was standing. And there, buried in month 19 of the summary stack, was the name Carter Blaine. She set down her coffee cup. When did Blaine first make contact with anyone connected to the Voss organization? She asked. The nearest analyst, a woman named Sarah, 30, methodical, the best reader of network structures Lena had ever worked with, didn't have to check her notes. First documented contact was 22 months ago, indirect. He used a broker named Greer, who had been placed inside the Voss organization approximately 2 years prior. Placed, Lena said, not recruited in situ. Placed. Yes. Greer was brought in with a specific brief. We believe his primary function was profiling. Lena was quiet for a moment. And the end objective? Isolation, Sarah said simply. They wanted Voss alone, without anyone in his inner circle who had independent resources or independent loyalty. Without me, Lena said. Without you specifically. You were identified as the primary stabilizing element in the organization's external threat response. Removing you removed the defense architecture they couldn't attack directly. Lena thought about that for a moment. Not with grief. She was past grief about this particular reality. She'd understood it for at least a year before the divorce papers arrived. What she was thinking about was timing. They moved when they did because they knew I was close to leaving anyway, she said. Sarah looked at her carefully. We think so. Someone in the Blaine network had visibility into the domestic situation. They accelerated the pressure campaign when they detected that the marriage was already under strain, which meant someone had been watching her marriage from the inside. Not just Philip Greer building a profile, someone with actual proximity, someone who could see the strain without being told about it. That narrowed it considerably. Lena picked up the summary and turned to the section on Donovan Reese. She had known about Donovan for 4 years. She had known he disliked her, which was fine. Plenty of people disliked her and conducted themselves professionally regardless. What she had known, and had not been able to fully prove until now, was that Donovan's dislike had become operational. He had started making choices designed to limit her influence. Small things, each deniable individually. Collectively, they told a story. The story was, Donovan Reese had been quietly working for 2 years to ensure that when Lena finally left, Adrian would not understand what he was losing until it was too late. Donovan hadn't conspired with Blaine for money. She was almost certain of that. He'd conspired because he believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment, that he was protecting Adrian from a woman he'd never understood and never trusted. That was almost worse than if it had been for money. Sarah, she said, what does Adrian know right now? As of 6 hours ago, his security lead was running traces on the Rotterdam file. He knows about Rotterdam. He may be at the Greer connection by now. So he's finding it. He's finding it. Lena nodded slowly. Good. I want him to find it himself. All of it. She set down the summary. If I hand it to him, he'll be grateful, and then he'll resent the gratitude. If he finds it himself, he'll understand it differently. She stood up, walked to the window. The grounds were quiet in the early morning. The security detail her family had maintained in her absence moved in patterns she recognized, the same patterns she'd designed. That steadied her. He's going to contact me, she said, probably within the next 3 days. He's going to think he's ready to have a conversation. And is he? Sarah asked. Lena looked at the grounds for a moment. No, she said. But he'll think he is, which is its own kind of progress. Carter Blaine walked into the meeting on Thursday afternoon looking like a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. That was his first mistake. In Adrian's experience, the people who decided ahead of time how a conversation would end were the people who hadn't accounted for the possibility that the other person in the room was smarter than them. Adrian met him in the private dining room of a club that was technically neutral territory, which both of them understood to mean that the politeness was performative and the recording equipment wasn't. Blaine was 54, broad across the shoulders, with the cultivated ease of a man who had spent his adult life in rooms where everyone deferred to him. He shook hands with Adrian like an equal, which told Adrian everything about how Blaine had assessed the power differential since the divorce. He'd assumed Adrian's standing had dropped. Good to finally sit down, Blaine said. Been a long time coming, Adrian agreed pleasantly. They ordered. They talked about nothing for 12 minutes. The Eastern Corridor accounts, a routing question, the kind of conversation Adrian could have in his sleep. He watched Blaine throughout, watched the way the man's eyes moved, the small expressions that crossed his face when he thought Adrian wasn't tracking him. Blaine was pleased with himself. That was the primary thing. He had the particular glow of a man who had executed a plan successfully and was now in the comfortable phase of enjoying the aftermath. How are things settling down for you? Blaine asked, with the tone of a man who had read somewhere that you should ask people about their lives. I heard you've been dealing with some organizational changes. Transition period, Adrian said. Any organization goes through them. Sure, Blaine nodded sagely. These things happen, especially when he stopped himself in a way that was obviously not stopping himself at all. Well, personal matters complicate professional ones. That's just human nature. They do, Adrian agreed. Though I'd imagine for you, without another performative pause. Well, it's none of my business. But I've heard the Marlowe name is back in circulation. That must create some complexity. Adrian set down his fork. How do you know that name? Blaine's ease didn't crack, but it shifted, the way ice shifts before it breaks, a sound more than a visible movement. It's been in certain circles. People talk. People do, Adrian said. Philip Greer talked quite a bit, it turns out. The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long, but it was the most informative 2 seconds of the entire lunch. Blaine recovered smoothly. Give him that. I'm not sure I know who... You met him 11 times in 18 months, Adrian said, same pleasant tone. I have the restaurants, I have the dates, I have the content of most of the conversations, which is, frankly, Carter. I'm going to be honest with you, it's impressive work. The profile he built was accurate. You correctly identified my blind spots. He picked his fork back up. You just chose the wrong target. Blaine said nothing. His face had gone very still. The woman you removed from my life, Adrian said, was the person who had been neutralizing threats against my organization for 6 years. Without her, I'd have had the Rotterdam seizure, the Harkins infiltration, the Bremer contract collapse, all of it, all at once, within about 18 months. He paused. But here's what I don't think you fully understood about your own strategy. He leaned forward slightly. You removed her from my house. You didn't remove her from the game, and she's been playing a great deal longer than you have. Blaine's jaw tightened. This is a very interesting theory. It's not a theory. I have the documents. I have the communication logs. I have Philip Greer, who is, presently, having a very different kind of conversation than this one. Adrian folded his hands on the table. What I want from you today isn't a confession. I don't need one. What I want is to understand who else is in this arrangement, because Carter, and I say this without any particular malice, if the answer is that this goes above you and you decided not to tell me, today is the last comfortable day you will have for a very long time. Blaine looked at him across the table. The easy confidence was gone. In its place was something older and less managed, a man doing very rapid calculations about which information kept him safer. There's a third party, Blaine said finally. I know there is. You don't know who. No, Adrian admitted. That's what you're going to tell me. Blaine was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his water glass, looked at it, set it back down without drinking. I don't know his name, Blaine said. That's the truth. I dealt with an intermediary. A woman, actually, handles communications for a group I've never been able to fully identify. They approached me. They had the Greer placement already running. I was brought in to manage the second phase. What was the second phase? Destabilization. After the divorce, once your organization started feeling pressure from the outside, the second phase was acquiring specific holdings. 3 of your distribution network nodes and 2 financial instruments that would be vulnerable if your cash flow was interrupted. He paused. It was supposed to happen fast, within 60 days of the separation. And it didn't happen because the Marlowe Alliance apparently anticipated it, Blaine said flatly. I had counterparties pulling out of agreements they'd committed to, paperwork disappearing. 2 of my legal intermediaries suddenly citing conflicts of interest and withdrawing. He looked at Adrian with an expression that was almost, despite everything, honest. Your ex-wife's people had already moved before the divorce was even finalized. I didn't know what I was dealing with until it was too late. Adrian sat back. The third party, a group Blaine didn't have a name for. An intermediary woman who managed communications for a structure that remained invisible even to the people it was using. Lena had anticipated it and moved defensively before the ink was dry on the papers he'd handed her. He thought about her face when she signed, the absolute steadiness of her hand. She'd known all of it. She had signed those papers knowing everything he was only now, 72 hours later, beginning to understand. She had let him sign them anyway. Adrian paid for lunch. He shook Carter Blaine's hand with the same professional neutrality he'd greeted him with. He walked out of the club into the afternoon light and sat in his car for several minutes before he started the engine. Marcus called. "The third party," Adrian said before Marcus could speak. "Blaine doesn't have the name, but I think I know someone who does." "Lena," Marcus said. "She's known about this entire thing." Adrian started the car. She knew who built it, she knew what they wanted, and she moved to block the second phase while she was still signing my divorce papers. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Sir, if she knew all of this and she still, why didn't she just tell you?" Adrian looked at his own hands on the steering wheel. Because he wouldn't have believed her. He would have looked at his quiet wife bringing him information about a conspiracy against his organization, and he would have thanked her and handed it to Donovan to verify, and Donovan would have buried it, and that would have been that. She had known exactly what would happen if she told him, so she had handled it herself and said nothing, and signed his papers, and walked out to the driveway to wait for 12 cars she had called. "Set up a meeting," Adrian said. "She won't see you." "I know, set it up anyway. Send the request through proper channels, through her people, not mine." He pulled out of the parking garage. "Tell them I understand the nature of what I'm asking. Tell them I'm not asking because I need something." "Aren't you?" Marcus said, and it was the second time in 3 days he'd said exactly that. "Yes," Adrian said, "but this time I know the difference." He drove. The city moved around him, ordinary and indifferent, the way cities always were when the people inside them were having days that were anything but. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, 3 words. "Not yet, Adrian." He didn't have to wonder who had sent it. He stopped at a red light and read it 3 more times. And the sick, certain knowledge settled into him like cold water. The knowledge that the woman he had spent 7 years underestimating was not waiting for his apology, was not holding her breath for his recognition, was not sitting somewhere hoping he would find his way back to her. She was conducting her own operation. She had been conducting it before the papers were signed, and she was conducting it now, and whether he was part of what came next or not was a decision that was entirely, completely hers to make. The light changed. Adrian drove, and for the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what happened next. The message stayed on his phone for 6 hours before Adrian allowed himself to respond to it. "Not yet, Adrian." He read it the way you read something that reorients your sense of where you are, slowly, repeatedly, the meaning shifting slightly each time as new information settled underneath it. She had his number. Of course she had his number. She had probably had a secondary line into his communications infrastructure for years, and he had never noticed because he had never looked for it, had never thought to look for it, because you don't look for a thing you've already decided isn't there. He put the phone face down on his desk at 4 p.m. and left it there until 10. Then he typed back, "When?" The response came 40 seconds later, which told him she'd been watching for it. "When I decide you're ready, not when you decide you are." He didn't respond to that one. There was nothing to say to it that wouldn't make him sound like a man arguing from a position of zero leverage, which was, accurately, the position he was in. He went to bed at midnight. He did not sleep. Donovan Reese arrived at the office at 8 a.m. on Friday the way he always did. Coffee from the place on the corner, the Financial Times folded under his arm, the look of a man whose life proceeded according to plan. He had maintained that look for 40 years. It was essentially structural at this point, built into the way he carried himself, indistinguishable from his actual face. Adrian was already in the conference room when Donovan walked in. So was Marcus. So were 2 men who stood by the far wall and did not introduce themselves, which Donovan would have understood immediately as a particular kind of message. Donovan looked at the room, looked at Adrian. Something moved behind his eyes, a rapid professional assessment, and then his expression settled back into its habitual composure. You could have called me in last night, Donovan said, pulling out a chair. I don't need the staging. Sit down, Donovan. He sat, folded the Financial Times, set his coffee cup to his right. Ritual gestures. The movements of a man who needed the familiar weight of small habits to stay level. Carter Blaine, Adrian said. I don't have a relationship with Carter Blaine. Philip Greer did. A beat. Greer was your hire. Greer was a placement. It was put inside this organization to build a behavioral profile, and he fed that profile to Blaine's network, which fed it to a third party we haven't identified yet. Adrian leaned forward. The profile was used to accelerate a specific outcome. My divorce. Donovan's expression didn't change, exactly. It densified. The way a face changes not by moving, but by whatever was behind it shifting into a different gear. That's a significant accusation, Donovan said. It's not an accusation. I have the communication logs. I have the restaurant locations, the dates, the content. I have Carter Blaine's own statement identifying the second phase of the operation. Adrian watched him. What I want from you specifically is the answer to one question. Did you know Greer was a plant when you vouched for his hiring, or did they get to you after? Silence. The coffee cup sat untouched. The Financial Times sat folded and unread. Donovan looked at the table surface for a moment, and for the first time in 9 years, Adrian watched him look genuinely old. I didn't know about Greer, Donovan said finally. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know what he was when he came in. But you found out. A longer pause. 8 months ago, Donovan said quietly. I found an irregularity in the communication logs. I traced it. I found... He stopped, restarted. I found enough to know he wasn't what he said he was. The room was very still. You found out 8 months ago, Adrian said, that you had an intelligence plant inside your organization, and you didn't tell me. I was going to... 8 months, Donovan. It was more complicated than, why? Not a question, a demand stripped down to one word. Donovan looked up, and what was in his face was not guilt exactly, and not defiance either. It was something more uncomfortable than both of those. It was the face of a man who had done something he knew was wrong and had spent 8 months constructing, for himself, the internal architecture of justification. Because of her, he said. Adrian said nothing. I found out about Greer and I started looking at what he'd been documenting and what the profile was being used for. And in the process of that, in the process of understanding the operation, I found out what she was. Donovan's jaw tightened. What she had been, the whole time. Who her family was. What she was connected to. What she had been doing inside your organization without your knowledge. She was protecting me. She was running a parallel operation inside your house, Donovan said, and his voice finally broke into something with heat in it. Without your knowledge, or your consent. Using resources and connections that you had no visibility into, making strategic decisions that affected your organization without consulting you. That is not protection, that is control. The word landed in the room and just sat there. Adrian looked at the older man across the table, looked at the absolute conviction in his face, the conviction of someone who had told himself a version of this story so many times it had calcified into something he could no longer examine. She neutralized 8 threats against my life and my organization, Adrian said, without telling you, which means she decided what you needed to know and what you didn't, which means she was managing you. Donovan leaned forward. I have watched powerful men get dismantled from the inside by the people closest to them. I have watched it happen slowly, the way a foundation erodes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, incrementally, until one day you realize the structure is dependent on the person doing the eroding. That is what she was doing, whether she meant it kindly or not. So you let someone else dismantle me instead, Adrian said. At least that way you controlled the process. Donovan was quiet. You knew about the operation against me. You knew Greer's profile was being used to push me toward the divorce. And you let it happen because you decided, on your own, without telling me, that her removal was worth whatever came with it. I thought I could manage the fallout. You thought you could manage me. Adrian's voice was flat, just like you said she was doing. That landed. He could see it land. Donovan's face went through something complicated and then closed back down, but not all the way. Not the way it usually did. Something had cracked in the surface, and the crack stayed visible. "You're terminated," Adrian said, "effective immediately. Marcus will handle the logistics. You'll receive what your contract specifies and nothing beyond it. And if I find anything in the next 6 weeks that tells me your involvement goes further than what you've described today, that arrangement gets revisited." He stood. "You've been with this organization for 16 years, and I'm not going to pretend that means nothing. But you made a strategic decision about my life that wasn't yours to make. And you made it believing you knew better than I did, and people almost died because of it." "People almost died because of the Marlowe name attached to your household," Donovan said, and it came out with the desperation of a man using his last argument. "The third party that ran this operation, I know who they are. I've known for 4 months, and when you find out, you'll understand why I—" "Who?" Adrian said. Donovan looked at him for a long moment. "The Crestwood Group," he said. The name hit the room like a structural change, like a sound frequency that reorganized something physical in the air. Marcus made a small noise that he immediately suppressed. Adrian stood completely still. The Crestwood Group was not a name that moved through ordinary criminal circles. It was not a name Adrian had encountered in any of the files Marcus had pulled, in any of Carter Blaine's statements, in any of the 43 pages of the Rotterdam document. It was a name that existed in a different register entirely. The kind of name you heard once, in a specific context, spoken by someone who immediately changed the subject. His father had mentioned it once. There are organizations that operate above the level of what we do. Not better. Not more powerful in the way you're thinking. Just differently positioned. They move the board. They don't play the pieces. "The Crestwood Group ran this operation," Adrian said. "They didn't run it. They funded the architecture and selected the target. Blaine and Greer were contractors. The actual direction came from them." Donovan's voice had dropped. "They've been interested in the Marlowe alliance for a long time, specifically in preventing its reconstitution under Lena. Your organization was incidental. You were an access point. The divorce was designed to destabilize the alliance by isolating her and making her appear vulnerable." Adrian sat back down. "They wanted her exposed," he said. "They wanted her to resurface. 7 years in your house, she was invisible to them. She'd gone completely dark. They needed to force her out." Donovan looked at him with something that might have been, beneath everything, something close to genuine remorse. "You were the mechanism, Adrian, not the target." The room processed that in silence. Lena had spent 7 years in Adrian's house, hidden, and someone had spent significant resources engineering the circumstances that would force her back into the open. And it had worked. She was out. She was visible. She had surfaced with 12 cars and a public display of the very identity she'd spent 7 years concealing, which meant the moment she walked out of Adrian's house and got into that Rolls-Royce on Hargrove Avenue, the people who had been hunting her knew exactly where she was. "She doesn't know," Adrian said. "I don't know what she knows. She knows about Blaine. She knows about Greer. She blocked the second phase of the acquisition operation." Adrian was on his feet again, moving now, the way he moved when his mind was 3 steps ahead of the room. "But if she doesn't know it's Crestwood, if she thinks she's dealing with a standard financial play, and she doesn't know there's a third tier above Blaine, she's exposed. She walked out of cover and she walked into their sightline, and she doesn't know who's at the end of it." He picked up his phone. The unknown number. "Not yet, Adrian." He called. It rang 4 times. 5, 6. A sound in his chest that he was not accustomed to and did not have a practiced response to. Something adjacent to fear, but with a sharper edge, because it wasn't fear for himself. It rang out. He called again. On the second try, it picked up. Not Lena's voice. A man. Calm, professional. "Ms. Marlowe is unavailable. This is Adrian Voss. I need to speak with her in the next 5 minutes, or she needs to know the name Crestwood before she takes any further external meetings this week." A pause, long enough to be a conversation happening on the other end. "Hold," the man said. 30 seconds, 40, 60. Then, "She's aware of the name." Pause. "She says thank you for the warning. She says you're 4 days behind." The line went dead. Adrian lowered the phone. 4 days behind. She'd known about Crestwood for 4 days. Since before the divorce, possibly. Since the suitcase and the signed papers and the carry-on she'd chosen over the Italian luggage. He turned to Marcus. "Get me everything we have on Crestwood. Everything. Any contact, any reference, any adjacent name. I don't care how thin the thread is. That's going to be a short file, Marcus said carefully. I know. Start building it. Donovan was still in his chair watching Adrian with the particular expression of a man who had given over his last piece of information and was now waiting to see what it had purchased him. Is there anything else? Adrian said. One thing. Donovan's voice was quiet. The woman Blaine mentioned, the intermediary who managed communications for Crestwood. He paused. I've seen her once. From a distance. I didn't know who she was at the time. Another pause. She was at a wedding, Adrian. She was a guest. The Marlowe estate at night had a particular quality of silence that Lena had grown up with and never stopped finding useful. It was the silence of a place that had been secured carefully, not loudly, not obviously, but in the specific way of people who understood that the most dangerous thing about noise was that it told you where sound wasn't coming from. She was in the operations room on the 3rd floor when Sarah came in with the expression she used when something had moved faster than projected. We have a problem, Sarah said. Lena looked up from the map she'd been working, a network diagram of Crestwood's visible connections, built over 4 days from fragments and inference, still more gaps than substance. The summit, Sarah said. There was in the world Lena had grown up in and walked back into, an event that occurred every 3 to 4 years. Not announced, not publicized, referred to in certain circles simply as a gathering. It was the occasion on which the entities that operated above the visible level of organized power sat in the same room, formally, and renegotiated the arrangements that governed their relationships. It was the closest thing to a constitutional convention that the invisible world had. The next one was in 11 days. Crestwood has filed a claim, Sarah said, and set a document on the table. Lena looked at it, read the first page, read it again. The claim was a formal allegation, filed under the protocols of the gathering, that the Marlowe Alliance had violated the terms of its inactive status by conducting unsanctioned intelligence operations during the period of Lena's self-imposed withdrawal. Specifically, and this was the part that made the air feel thinner, the claim alleged that Lena had used her position inside the Voss household to conduct covert operations on behalf of the Alliance without registering the activity, which under the gathering's protocols was a sanctionable offense. The sanction being requested was dissolution, not of her leadership, of the Alliance itself. Lena sat down. They can file this, she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Under Article 9 of the Standing Protocols, any recognized entity can file a dissolution claim against an Alliance member that has been inactive and subsequently reactivated if they can demonstrate unauthorized activity during the inactive period. Sarah paused. The activity they're citing is your protection work on the Voss organization, the covert neutralization of the Rotterdam action, the Harkins infiltration, the Bremer contract, everything you did to protect him. They're citing it as evidence of unauthorized Alliance activity. The things I did to help him, Lena said slowly, are the things they're using as the legal basis to destroy my family's organization. Yes. The room was very quiet. The elegance of it was genuinely nauseating. 7 years of quiet, careful work. 8 incidents of protection, each one chosen not because it served the Alliance's interests, but because she had loved a man and had tried to keep him safe while being invisible about it. And every single one of those choices had left a record, because you cannot act in the world without leaving traces. And Crestwood had found every trace and compiled them into a legal instrument that could end everything her family had built across 3 generations. When was the claim filed? She asked. 48 hours ago, the moment you came out publicly. The 12 cars. They were waiting for you to make a visible move. The reemergence was the trigger. The convoy. The moment she had allowed herself to be seen, the moment she had decided, after 7 years, that she was done being invisible. They had been waiting for that moment. The entire operation, Greer, Blaine, the divorce, the isolation, all of it, had been designed not to destroy her but to force her out of hiding at a moment of their choosing, so they could use her reemergence as the legal trigger for the dissolution claim. She had played directly into it. She had known about Crestwood, and she had underestimated the depth of the instrument they'd prepared. 4 days behind, she had told Adrian's people. She had been wrong. She had been further behind than that. What's the response window, she said. 10 days to file a counterclaim or present a defense before the gathering. Who adjudicates? A panel of 5. 3 are historically neutral. 1 is affiliated with the Hargrove Collective, which has had favorable relations with Crestwood for years. Sarah's voice was careful. The 5th seat is currently vacant. There's been a dispute about succession. Whoever fills that seat in the next 10 days effectively controls the outcome. Who has the right to appoint the 5th seat? Sarah looked at her. Under the succession protocols, Sarah said, the right of appointment for a vacant panel seat falls to the most senior active alliance member who is not party to the dispute. Lena already knew what was coming. She could feel it forming in the architecture of the problem, the way you can feel a room's shape in the dark before you turn on a light. And the most senior active alliance member not party to this dispute, she said, is a man who rejoined the standing protocols 14 months ago, Sarah said, when he inherited his father's seat without realizing it had gathering standing. She set a second document on the table beside the first. His father was a registered member. The seat transferred automatically on inheritance. Lena looked at the document, at the name at the top, Adrian Voss. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the security silence of a well-protected house. The silence of a situation that had just restructured itself around a fact nobody had anticipated, least of all the man whose name was on the page. Adrian Voss had inherited, through his father, a standing seat in the governance structure of the gathering. He didn't know this. He had no idea this world existed in the way it existed. He had spent his entire career operating at a level that this structure considered, generously, the visible layer. And he was the only person with the legitimate authority to appoint the panel member who would decide whether her family's organization survived. Lena looked at the document for a long time. Then she thought about the signed divorce papers, the coffee she'd rinsed away, the carry-on bag, the 4 hours she had spent at the Whitmore estate after walking out, waiting in the kitchen with the lights off while the convoy assembled, giving him one last window to come after her before she closed the door on that version of her life. He hadn't come. She had gotten into the car, and now the instrument built to destroy her required her to go back, not to beg, not to explain, not to apologize for the 7 years she had spent being underestimated in his house while she held his world together with quiet hands. She had to go back and ask the man who had handed her divorce papers across a marble table to use power. He didn't know he had, in a world he didn't know existed, on behalf of a woman he had spent 7 years failing to see. And she had 10 days. Get me a line to Marcus Webb, she said. Sarah looked startled. Not to Voss directly? Not yet. Lena stood, straightened the documents, and looked at the network diagram on the table. All those gaps, all that inference, all the incomplete picture of an enemy that had been more patient and more prepared than she had given them credit for. I need to know he understands what he's walking into before I ask him to walk into it. She looked at the empty 5th seat marked on the panel chart. Because if he goes in there without understanding the full scope, and he makes the wrong move, she said, it won't just be the alliance that falls. She picked up her phone. It'll be both of us. Sarah left the room without being asked. That was the thing about people Lena had trained herself. They understood when a phone call required the particular privacy of a woman who was about to do something that cost her something. Marcus picked up on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. Not surprised, not smug, just a man who had been doing this long enough to know when convergence was inevitable. How much does he know about the gathering protocols? Lena asked. A pause. Nothing. He didn't know his father had standing until about 40 minutes ago when I pulled the inheritance documentation. He's been sitting with it. How is he sitting with it? Quietly, Marcus said, which for him means badly. She almost smiled at that. Almost. He needs a briefing before I'll meet with him. Full scope. Crestwood's history, the claim, the panel structure, what the 5th seat means. I need him informed, not reactive. He's not going to like receiving a briefing from your people. He doesn't have to like it. He has to understand it. She paused. Can you get him to accept it? If I tell him it comes from you, yes. Then tell him. And after the briefing, she looked at the panel chart on the table, the empty seat, the 10-day window narrowing by the hour. After the briefing, she said, I'll meet him. Neutral ground. Not his house. Not mine. He'll agree to anything you name. I know, she said, and the flatness in her own voice surprised her slightly. Not coldness, but the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent years being the one who managed everything quietly and was now being asked to manage one more thing, the hardest thing, in the least amount of time. She ended the call, sat alone with the documents and the diagram and the sound of the estate settling around her in the dark. She thought about something her father had told her once, when she was 17 and already learning the shape of the world she'd been born into. They had been sitting in this same room, at this same table, and he had been showing her a network diagram not unlike the one spread in front of her now, and she had asked him what you did when the architecture of a problem required you to trust the one person you had the least reason to trust. He had looked at the diagram for a long time before answering. "You don't trust the person," he had said. "You trust the necessity. The person is just the instrument the situation selected. Your job is to make sure the instrument is properly prepared before you put it to use." She had spent the last 10 years thinking he was right about most things. She was less certain about that one tonight. Adrian read the briefing document in one sitting, which took 2 hours and 20 minutes, and he did not speak once during that time. The analyst Lena had sent, a quiet man named Holt, late 40s, the kind of professional stillness that comes from years of delivering information to people who react unpredictably, sat across the conference table and answered every question Adrian asked with precision and no editorializing, which Adrian recognized and respected even in the middle of everything else he was processing. His father's seat, the gathering, the panel, the claim, the dissolution instrument built from the records of every quiet thing Lena had done to keep him safe. When he finished reading, Adrian set the document down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and looked at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said, "The fifth seat appointment. Walk me through what it requires procedurally." Holt walked him through it. A formal declaration filed with the gathering secretariat, naming the appointee. The appointee had to meet 3 criteria: recognize standing in their own right, no conflict of interest with either party in the dispute, and acceptance of the role's neutrality obligations for the duration of the panel. "If I appoint someone compromised," Adrian said, "the claim succeeds." "Correct." "If I appoint someone genuinely neutral with real standing, the panel balance shifts against Crestwood's position." "That is the assessment, yes." "And Crestwood knows I have this appointment right." "They have known since the inheritance documentation was filed 14 months ago. It's part of why the operation was structured as it was." Holt paused, with the care of a man delivering a difficult piece. "You were not an incidental access point, Mr. Voss. You were a specific selection, a man with inherited panel standing who had no knowledge of that standing and no context for the world it belonged to, and who could be maneuvered into a position where using that standing would require him to either act on behalf of someone he'd discarded or watch her organization be destroyed." Adrian looked at him. "They built the entire operation around the appointment. Around making it as difficult as possible for you to use it correctly," Holt said. "A man who had just divorced his wife, who had been manipulated into distrusting her, who had been isolated from the information that would allow him to understand the stakes. That man, when he finally learned he had the power to intervene, would be the least credible and least motivated person to do so." The room was very still. "She knew this," Adrian said. "Miss Marlowe has known about your inherited standing for approximately 8 months. 8 months. Around the same time, Donovan had found out about Greer and said nothing. Around the same time, the pressure campaign had started its final acceleration toward the divorce. She had known for 8 months that the endgame required him, and she had signed his papers anyway, and she had gotten into the car, and she had sent him a 3-word message telling him he wasn't ready yet. She had been waiting for him to get ready. Not because she needed him to save her, because the only way the instrument could function correctly was if the man holding it understood, fully and without illusion, exactly what he was holding and why. Adrian stood. "Tell her I'll meet her." She anticipated that response, Holt said, and produced a card with an address. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Adrian took the card, looked at it, looked at Holt. "One question," he said, off the record, not for the briefing. "In your assessment, does she want me there because she needs the appointment or because she needs something else?" Holt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "In my experience with Miss Marlowe," he said carefully, "those 2 things have never been separate." He left. Adrian stood in the empty conference room with the address on the card and the briefing document and the specific clarifying weight of a man who had spent 3 days finding out who his wife actually was, and had arrived, at the end of all that finding, at the same place he probably would have arrived 7 years ago if he had ever once sat still long enough to look. The gathering was in 9 days. The fifth seat was empty. And somewhere across the city, in a house that had been waiting for her return for 7 years, the woman he had handed a pen to was sitting with documents that could end 3 generations of her family's work, waiting to see if the man she had quietly protected across 7 years of being invisible could manage, just once, to show up for her the way she had always shown up for him. He put the card in his pocket. He turned off the conference room light. He went to get ready for the most important meeting of his life, one that no amount of money, force, or operational excellence could prepare him for, because what it required was not strength in any form he had ever practiced. What it required was the one thing he had spent his entire life treating as a liability. The address on the card was a building Adrian had driven past 100 times without registering, a 4-story structure in the financial district that presented itself as an architectural firm, the kind of place with a discreet brass nameplate and windows that reflected the street back at you without letting you see inside. The kind of building that didn't want to be looked at, which in this city meant it had spent considerable money achieving that quality of invisibility. He arrived at 9:58 a.m. He had not slept. He had showered, changed, eaten half a piece of toast standing over the kitchen sink, and spent the drive over doing the thing he did before difficult meetings, emptying himself of expectation, clearing the internal architecture so that whatever walked into the room could be assessed without the distortion of what he'd wanted it to be. It had never been harder to do than it was this morning. The lobby was marble and low light, and a woman at a desk who looked at him the way people look at someone they've been briefed on. Recognition without warmth, professional acknowledgement without welcome. She said his name. She pointed to the elevator. She told him 4th floor without being asked. The elevator opened directly into a room. Not a waiting room. Not a corridor. The room, a wide, sparse space with a long table, 4 chairs, and windows along the north wall that looked out over the city at an angle that showed you the skyline without showing you the street below. The effect was deliberate. You could see far, but you couldn't see down. You were oriented toward distance, not ground. Lena was standing at the window when he walked in. She was wearing dark gray, not black, not the soft colors she'd worn in the house on Hargrove Avenue. Something with more structure to it. Her hair was back. She looked like herself, Adrian realized. Not the version of herself she'd worn for 7 years in his house, the softer presentation, the careful diminishment. She looked like the person she actually was, and the difference was not dramatic in any single visible way, but was total in its overall effect, the way a room looks completely different when the lighting changes, even though every object in it is the same. She did not turn when he walked in. He stopped about 8 feet from her. He did not sit down. "Thank you for coming," she said, still facing the window. "You knew I would. I knew you'd received enough information to understand why you had to. That's not the same as knowing you'd come willingly." She turned then and looked at him directly, the way she had always looked at him when she was deciding something. Not through him, not past him, fully at him, with the specific quality of attention that he had spent 7 years interpreting as patience and was now understanding had been, all along, assessment. How much of the briefing document did you actually absorb versus read? All of it. The panel structure. Yes. The appointment criteria. Yes. The specific language of Crestwood's dissolution claim and which of your protocols it leverages. Yes, Lena. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. I read the document. I understand the situation. She studied him for a moment. Then she moved to the table and sat, and gestured at the chair across from her, and he sat. And for a moment they were just 2 people at a table in a room above the city, which was both completely ordinary and the most charged situation he had been in his entire adult life. The appointment has to be filed within 8 days, she said. The appointee needs to be someone with legitimate standing who Crestwood cannot successfully challenge as conflicted. I have 3 candidates. She slid a single sheet across the table. I need you to choose. He looked at the sheet. 3 names, 3 paragraphs of background each, precise and spare. You need me to choose, he said. The appointment is yours. I can advise, but I cannot make it. If I select the name and you simply rubber stamp it, Crestwood will challenge the appointment as directed rather than independent, and the Secretariat will likely sustain the challenge. So it has to visibly be my decision. It has to actually be your decision. There's a difference. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to be a mechanism. I'm asking you to look at those three names, understand what each of them brings to the panel, and make a judgment. Adrian looked at the sheet. The three names. He read carefully. Not fast, not performing thoroughness, actually reading. The first name was a man with deep historical ties to two of the three neutral panel seats, which meant his appointment would consolidate the neutral bloc, but potentially read as alliance building rather than genuine independence. The second was a woman with impeccable standing and no visible connection to any party in the dispute, which was almost too clean. In Adrian's experience, people with no visible connections had invisible ones, and invisible ones were the ones that moved at critical moments. The third was a man named Callum Reese, no relation to Donovan, who had been inactive in gathering affairs for 11 years following a dispute of his own, had returned to standing status 8 months ago, and had a documented history of ruling against Crestwood-affiliated entities in 3 separate matters over 2 decades. Callum Reese, Adrian said. Lena's expression moved slightly. Why? Because the first one consolidates too visibly and gives Crestwood a structural argument against the bloc. Because the second one is too clean, which means something is buried, and I don't have time to find it before the filing deadline. Because Reese has a documented record that speaks for itself without requiring anyone to argue for his impartiality. He set the sheet down. And because he's been watching Crestwood operate for 20 years, and he came back to standing status 8 months ago, which is when they filed the inheritance documentation on my father's seat. He came back because he saw this coming. The room was quiet. You read the document, Lena said. I told you I did. She looked at him for a long moment, the full attention look, the assessment he now understood for what it was. Reese was my recommendation, she said. I didn't put him first on the list because I didn't want you to default to the first name. I know, he said. You put him third. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, something more complicated than that. The expression of a person recalibrating. File the appointment today, she said, before close of business. Crestwood will know within hours. Once they know Reese is on the panel, the shape of the next 8 days changes. How does it change? They'll move against the documentation directly. Try to challenge the evidentiary basis for the protection activities they're citing. She leaned forward slightly. Which means they'll need to access records they don't currently have, which means they'll try to get into our systems in the next 72 hours. Or mine, Adrian said, or yours. The Rotterdam documentation is in your archive. The Harkins and Bremer files are split between your records and ours. They need both sets to make the evidentiary case, and right now they only have fragments. Adrian felt the shape of it forming. You need me to let them try. I need you to let them think they can try. I need them moving toward your archive because I need to know who their access point is inside your current operation. She met his eyes. Donovan is gone. Greer is gone. But operations like Crestwood don't run on 2 points of contact. There's someone still inside. The air in the room changed temperature. You know there's still someone inside my organization, Adrian said. I suspect it. I don't have confirmation. And you want to use my archive as bait. I want to use the next 72 hours to find out who reaches for it and from which direction. She held his gaze. I know what I'm asking. I know what it means if I'm right and we use this correctly. I also know what it means if there's a leak we don't catch before the gathering. Adrian pushed back from the table. Not away. Just the movement of a man who needed to shift physically while his mind ran the calculation. He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the skyline the way she had been looking at it when he walked in. The city from up here looked manageable, ordered. It never actually was. If I do this, he said, and there's someone still inside, someone we flesh out, I need them taken intact. I need information, not a removal. Agreed. And I need your people working the access attempt in real time. Not after, not from the file records, live. I can have Sarah's team integrated into your monitoring architecture within 4 hours. Your people in my systems. Yes. He turned from the window. You understand what you're asking me to trust you with. I understand exactly what I'm asking. She didn't look away. The same thing you should have trusted me with 7 years ago. The sentence landed without cruelty. She wasn't weaponizing it, wasn't using it to wound. She was just stating the accurate shape of the thing, the way she had always stated accurate things, quietly and without decoration, and leaving him to sit with the accuracy of it. 4 hours, he said. Get Sarah's team the access credentials through Marcus. Nobody comes into the building. Remote integration only until I say otherwise. Understood. And Lena. He stopped. The woman. The Crestwood intermediary who was at our wedding. I need her name. Lena was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to confirm that for 4 months, she said. But you have a candidate. Another pause. Longer. Her name, Lena said carefully, is Diana Voss. The name fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Adrian stood absolutely still. My father's sister, he said. She died. She died in 2009. There was a reported accident, Lena said, in Portugal. The body was identified by a single witness and cremated within 48 hours under a public health provision. She held his gaze steadily. I found the witness 3 months ago. He's been living in Montenegro under a different name. He confirmed the identification was false. Diana Voss, his aunt. The woman who had attended his wedding, kissed his cheek, told Lena she was a lovely girl, in a tone that had seemed at the time like ordinary social politeness. The woman who had been dead for 15 years, who had apparently been running communications for the organization that had spent 2 years engineering the destruction of everything Adrian had built and everything Lena had spent 7 years quietly protecting. Adrian sat back down. His legs made the decision again. She's the one who identified you, he said, to Crestwood. She knew who you were. She knew my father, Lena said. They had a history before I was born. She knew exactly who I was when you brought me home, and she spent 7 years waiting for the right moment to use it. A breath, the first one he'd heard that wasn't completely controlled. I didn't know it was her until 3 months ago. I thought I was dealing with a Crestwood functionary. When I found out who she actually was, she paused. I understood why I hadn't been able to map the network correctly. I was looking for a professional operator. I wasn't looking for someone with a personal history in both directions. Where is she? That's what I don't know. Lena pressed her hands flat on the table, a gesture he recognized, a gesture he used himself, the physical anchor of a person who needed to stay level. I believe she'll surface during the gathering. The dissolution claim is personal for her as much as it's strategic. She'll want to be present. Then we have 8 days to find her before she has the audience she wants. Yes. Adrian looked at her across the table. The woman who had been invisible in his house for 7 years, who had known things he hadn't known and protected things he hadn't known, needed protecting and carried weights he had never once offered to share, who was sitting here now asking him not to save her, but to stand beside her in a fight she was already equipped to handle, asking him because the architecture of the situation required it, yes, but also, and he could see it in the controlled precision of everything she wasn't saying, because she had never stopped believing he was capable of being the person this moment needed. File the appointment, she said, then go back to your office and wait for them to reach for the archive. When they do, and they will, within 48 hours, don't react. Let it run. Let Sarah's team trace it to the source. And if the source is someone I trust, she looked at him steadily. Prepare yourself for that possibility. He nodded. Once, the nod of a man who was done negotiating the terms of commitment and was simply committed. He stood to leave. Adrian. He stopped. She was looking at the table, not at him, and for just a moment, one unguarded second between one breath and the next, she looked exactly like the woman who had stood at a kitchen window watching rain streak down glass and thought about patience. I know why you signed those papers the way you did, she said. I know what was in your head. I want you to know I'm not operating from anger. I stopped being angry about it a long time ago. He waited. But I need you to understand something before this goes any further. She looked up. If we get through this, if the claim fails and Crestwood loses the panel and Diana surfaces, and we handle what happens when she does. When all of that is done, I'm not going back to Hargrove Avenue. I'm not going back to standing behind you at your meetings. I'm not going back to any version of what we were. Her voice was level, clear, the voice of a woman who had decided something so thoroughly that the decision had become structural. Whatever comes next has to be built from what's true. Not what's convenient, not what's operational, what's true. The room was very quiet. I know, Adrian said. He meant it. That was the thing she would have to decide whether to believe. Whether the man standing in front of her had actually arrived, in the space of 5 days and 43 pages, and a briefing document and a name that should have been buried in Portugal, at a genuine understanding of the size of what he had wasted. He couldn't make her believe it. That wasn't something you could engineer. He left. In the elevator going down, he pulled out his phone and called Marcus. File the Reese appointment, he said, right now before anything else. Done within the hour, Marcus said. Anything else? Open the Rotterdam archive. Full access, external-facing layer only. Make it look like a routine administrative review. He watched the lobby rise up through the glass elevator wall. Then watch every single thing that touches it. You think there's still someone inside? I think there's always someone inside, Adrian said. The question is whether we're fast enough to catch them before they know we're looking. The elevator opened. He walked through the marble lobby and out into the city, into the ordinary noise of a morning that had no idea what was moving through it. 8 days, 1 vacant panel seat now filled, 1 dead woman somewhere in the world preparing to surface, and somewhere inside his own organization, a hand already reaching toward a file it had no right to touch. His phone buzzed before he reached the car. Marcus. Someone just pinged the Rotterdam archive. Internal credentials. The access request came from a terminal inside the building. Adrian stopped walking. The credentials belong to a user account registered 18 months ago under the name of your personal legal attaché. He stood on the sidewalk in the morning light, cars moving past him, the city entirely indifferent, and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who has just identified the last piece of a structure he should have seen from the beginning. His personal legal attaché. The woman who had been in every sensitive meeting for a year and a half, who had drafted the divorce papers, who had handed him the pen. Tiptuk Part 4, Wantain Part 4, Trung 2002. Her name was Claire Ashton, 36 years old, Harvard Law, recommended by a colleague Adrian trusted, brought in 18 months ago to handle the complex jurisdictional paperwork that came with expanding into 3 new territories. She had been precise, professional, prepared for every meeting before it started. She had a quality he had valued without examining, the quality of someone who anticipated what you needed before you asked. He had interpreted that as competence. It was something else entirely. Adrian stood on the sidewalk for 4 more seconds. Then he started walking back toward his car with the measured pace of a man who had learned, over many years, that the moment you let urgency show in your body was the moment you lost the advantage urgency was supposed to give you. He called Marcus. Don't lock the credentials, he said. Let the access run. She's pulling the Rotterdam file index. Not the documents themselves, the structural map. Who owns what? Which entities connect to which? Let her pull it. Adrian, if we lock it now, she knows we've seen her and she goes dark. I need to know where that map goes after she has it. He reached his car, didn't get in, stood beside it. Is Sarah's team integrated yet? They came online 11 minutes ago. Get Sarah on the map trace. The moment Claire moves that file to an external location or a secondary device, I want the destination. He hung up. Got in the car, sat with his hands on the wheel, and didn't start the engine. Claire Ashton had drafted the divorce papers. He turned that over slowly, the way you turn something sharp. Carefully, aware of the edges. She hadn't just been inside his organization for 18 months, gathering intelligence. She had been in the room where the instrument of Lena's exposure was created. She had typed the language. She had formatted the pages. She had handed the folder to his personal assistant for delivery to his desk. And she had done all of that knowing what those papers would trigger, knowing that Lena's signature on them would begin the sequence that led to the convoy, the re-emergence, the visible return of the Marlowe heir that Crestwood had spent 2 years engineering. She had been in the room when it was built, which meant she wasn't a peripheral contact. She was the on-site architect. His phone buzzed. Sarah's team. He read the message twice. The file map had moved to a secondary device, a tablet registered to a personal account. And from there, in an automated sequence that had clearly been set up in advance, it had transmitted to an encrypted relay in a server cluster that Sarah's team traced, within 4 minutes, to a communications infrastructure registered to a holding company in the Cayman Islands that was, after 2 more minutes of work, connected to a parent entity whose registered agent was a law firm in Zurich that had appeared once before, in the very bottom layer of the Rotterdam document, as a dormant entity with a single historical connection. Simone Conrad Consulting. Adrian, read that last part 3 times. Sarah's team had traced Claire Ashton's file transfer to an entity that was connected, however distantly, however many layers down, to the cover identity Lena had used for her own protection work. He sat with that for a moment. Then he called Sarah directly, bypassing Marcus. "The relay," he said when she picked up. "The connection to the Simone Conrad entity. How old is it?" "The structural link was established 14 months ago," Sarah said. "Retroactively inserted into the registration history. Someone modified the filing documents to create the appearance of a historical connection that didn't actually exist. They planted the connection." "Yes. If the relay is ever traced, which they expected it eventually would be, the trail leads to infrastructure that looks like it belongs to Ms. Marlowe, not to Crestwood." The room he was sitting in was a car on a city street, but it felt suddenly much smaller. "They built a frame," he said. "A very thorough one," Sarah said, and he could hear in her voice the controlled anger of a professional who respected craftsmanship and despised its application here. "If this relay had been discovered through standard channels, through your security team without our involvement, the trace would have landed on Marlowe infrastructure. It would have looked like Ms. Marlowe was running intelligence operations against you through an internal asset. It would have confirmed every accusation in the dissolution claim and added a criminal dimension to it." "They weren't just trying to destroy the alliance," Adrian said. "They were going to use me to do it. My discovery of the frame was supposed to be the final evidence." "That's our assessment." Claire Ashton had not been activated to gather intelligence. She had been placed to be found. The Rotterdam access, the file map, the relay, the planted connection. The entire sequence was designed to be discovered by Adrian's security apparatus at a moment of maximum pressure, producing evidence that would make Adrian himself the instrument of Lena's destruction. His divorce, his isolation, his eventual investigation, all of it funneled toward the moment he found the breadcrumbs they'd laid and followed them to a conclusion they had written before he started looking. He started the car. "Where is Claire Ashton right now?" he said. "Still at her desk," Sarah said. "She completed the file access 11 minutes ago and has been on a phone call since." "Who is she calling?" A pause. "We're working on that." "Work faster." He pulled into traffic. "I'm 20 minutes from the office. Nobody approaches her before I'm in the building." "Understood." He drove. The city moved around him with its ordinary momentum. Traffic lights, delivery trucks, people on sidewalks with coffee cups and phones. The entire indifferent machinery of a morning that had no idea. It was the morning that everything Adrian Voss had built was either going to hold or come apart. He called Lena. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she had been waiting. "Claire Ashton," he said. A beat of silence. "I didn't know her name until 30 seconds ago," Lena said. "Sarah just flagged me." "The frame, the planted relay. Did you know about it?" "I knew there was a framing instrument somewhere in the architecture. I didn't know its specific form or where it was positioned." Her voice was tight, not panicked, but the controlled tightness of a person managing the gap between what they'd prepared for and what had actually arrived. "This is more elegant than I anticipated. They were going to use me to file the evidence against you." "Yes." "In front of the panel. I find the frame, I bring it forward as evidence of your operation against me. It corroborates the dissolution claim and adds to it, and I'm the one who does it. The man with the inherited appointment seat, discrediting himself and you simultaneously." He stopped at a red light. "They win the panel, they get the dissolution, and I'm the one who handed it to them." "And Diana watches from a seat in the room," Lena said quietly. The light changed. He didn't move for a second, and the car behind him honked, and he drove. "I need to take Claire Ashton out of that building without her knowing she's been identified," he said. "If she goes dark, Diana loses her last on-site asset, and she's navigating the next 8 days blind." "You want to run her," Lena said. "It wasn't a question. I want to feed her. Controlled information. Whatever Diana needs to believe the frame is still intact, that I'm building toward the discovery they designed." He turned onto the street that ran alongside his building. "Can your team manage the relay?" Make it look like the file map transfer completed correctly. Even if we intercept Claire before she can confirm, Sarah can do that. Then I need Claire Ashton in a room with me in the next 30 minutes, and I need her to walk out of that room believing nothing has changed. A pause. Adrian, Lena said. Yes. She's been trained for this. If you push too hard, she'll know. I know. She's been in your orbit for 18 months. She knows how you operate. I know that too. He parked. Sat for a moment. That's actually the only advantage I have right now. She's built a model of how I behave. I'm going to behave exactly like that model predicts, right up until the moment it matters that I don't. He could hear Lena processing that. Call me when you're out of the room with her, she said. There's one more thing, he said. The gathering. Diana will be there. I believe so. Then we need to be there first. Not just represented, present. Both of us. He got out of the car. Whatever the protocols are for that. However it has to be arranged. I need to be in that room when she walks in, and I need her to see us together before she understands what that means. The silence on the line had a particular quality. The silence of someone who had been operating alone for a very long time, being offered something they had stopped expecting. I'll have Holt file the attendance documentation today, Lena said. Good. He walked toward the building entrance. Adrian. Her voice stopped him one more time, and he stood on the sidewalk with the phone against his ear and the morning light cutting hard across the glass facade of the building where Claire Ashton was sitting at her desk, believing she was invisible. Don't let her see it in your face. See what? That you know, Lena said. That's always the thing that gives it away, not the question you ask. The look you're wearing when you ask it. He thought about that. 7 years, he said quietly. You watched me walk into rooms. Every one, she said. You drop your left shoulder when you're angry. You go very still when you're afraid. And when you know something the other person doesn't know, you want them to know you know. You get a particular look around your eyes. What kind of look? The kind that costs you, she said. Don't wear it. He straightened his jacket, rolled his left shoulder back deliberately, arranged his face into the expression of a man arriving at his office on an ordinary morning with ordinary things on his agenda. I'll call you when I'm out, he said. He walked in. Claire Ashton was at her desk on the second floor, and she looked up when he passed her office. A brief professional acknowledgement, the look of an employee clocking their employer's arrival. Nothing in her face, nothing in her posture. 18 months of practiced invisibility, and she wore it as well as Lena had worn hers, which was the thing that made Adrian's chest tighten as he walked past with a neutral nod. He knew what it cost to be that invisible that consistently. He stopped in the doorway of her office. Claire, he said, I need a jurisdiction review on the Harkins documentation before end of week. Can you pull the original filing records and give me an assessment of the cross-border exposure? She looked up, professional, calm. Of course. I'll have it to you by Thursday. Today, he said pleasantly. Sooner if you can. A flicker, small, gone in under a second. I'll start on it now, she said. He nodded, moved on toward his own office. His hands were steady, his left shoulder was back. His face was the face of a man who needed a jurisdiction review and nothing more. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and sent one message to Marcus and one to Sarah simultaneously. She just accessed the Harkins documentation. She's going to pass the cross-border exposure map to the relay within the hour. When she does, let it go through. But tag every piece. I want to know every node that touches it between here and Diana. He set his phone down. 8 days to the gathering. One woman in an office 2 floors below him, reaching for a file he had just handed her. One woman across the city who had spent 7 years being invisible and was now, finally, fully visible and ready. And somewhere in the world, a dead woman was making preparations to walk into a room and watch everything she had built come to its conclusion. Adrian looked at the city through his office window. The same city, the same skyline, the same indifferent machinery moving below, and felt for the first time in 5 days something that was not dread and not desperation, but the cold, clarifying sensation of a man who finally understood the full dimensions of the fight he was in and had decided without reservation that he was not going to lose it. His phone lit up. Sarah. She's moving the Harkins map. Relay is live. We have the full node chain. Diana's location is in the chain. She's already in the city. Diana Voss had been dead for 15 years, and she had used every one of those years well. That was the thing Adrian kept returning to as Marcus laid out the location trace on the conference table at 6 a.m. on the morning of the gathering. The sheer productive efficiency of a woman who had chosen disappearance not as retreat, but as a working condition. She had built Crestwood from nothing, or close to nothing, in the years following her faked death, using the freedom of non-existence the way a surgeon uses a clean field. No interference, no history, no one looking at her hands. The node chain from Claire Ashton's relay had taken Sarah's team 4 days to fully map. What they found at the end of it was not a headquarters, not a compound, not any of the physical infrastructure Adrian's instincts would have reached for. Diana operated from movement, a rotation of 3 residences across 2 countries, none of them registered in any name with any connection to any entity that touched Crestwood directly. The city location Sarah had flagged was a serviced apartment in the northeast quarter, leased to a consulting firm that existed only on paper, on the 14th floor of a building with 4 exit routes and a private elevator that required a key card not issued by the building's management. She had been 40 minutes from Adrian's office for 6 weeks. He thought about that while Marcus talked. About Lena in the house on Hargrove Avenue, moving through rooms Diana had sat in at the wedding 12 years ago. About the particular patience required to be that close to something for that long and not move until the moment was exactly right. He had once admired that quality in himself. Understood now he had learned it from watching people who actually had it. "She'll be at the gathering," Marcus said. "We've confirmed a registered attendee under the Crestwood entity. The name on the registration is a functionary, but the biometric access request filed with the Secretariat matches a profile in Sarah's database that corresponds to Diana." "She filed biometrics," Adrian said, "under the functionary name. She's planning to walk in as someone else." "She can't. Not with Reese on the panel. He's seen her before. He'll know. Unless she's banking on Reese not having grounds to object to an accredited attendee's presence before the panel convenes." Marcus paused. "By the time anyone formally identifies her, the session will have started. And once it starts, the protocols require it to run to conclusion," Adrian finished. He looked at the location map. "She wants to be in the room when the claim is adjudicated. She wants to watch it happen." "Personal," Marcus said. "Very." He stood up. "What time does the gathering open?" 9 a.m. Panel convenes at 10. "Then we have 3 hours." He looked at Marcus. "Get me a car, not the usual one, something she won't have in her file." Lena was already dressed when Adrian arrived at the Marlowe estate at 6:40 a.m. She opened the door herself. No staff, no security at the immediate entrance, just her, in a dark suit that fit her the way clothing fits someone who has stopped thinking about what they look like and started thinking about what they're walking into. She looked at him on the doorstep for a moment. "You found her location," she said. 14 floors up in the northeast quarter." He held out his phone with the address. "She's planning to walk into the gathering under a cover registration." Lena looked at the address. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, a more complex reaction, the expression of someone who had been tracking a shape in the dark for months and was now seeing it in full light and finding it both exactly what they expected and somehow still worse. "That building belonged to my father," she said quietly. Adrian looked at her. "He sold it in 2004. Diana was at the closing dinner." She handed the phone back. "She's been in that building before. She knows every exit." She turned back into the house. "Come in. Sarah has something you need to see before we leave." He followed her through the house, through rooms that were nothing like the Whitmore estate's curated grandeur, rooms that were used and lived in and layered with the accumulation of a family that had occupied the same space across generations. Books stacked in ways that suggested they were actually read. A coat thrown over a chair. A coffee cup on a windowsill that had left a ring on the paint. The operations room on the 3rd floor had 4 people in it. Sarah was at the center table, and she looked up when they walked in with the expression of someone who had been awake for 30 hours and had stopped noticing. "The dissolution claim documentation," Sarah said, without preamble. "We've been working the evidentiary basis. The 8 incidents Crestwood cited as unauthorized alliance activity during the inactive period." She turned a laptop to face them. "We found the problem." Adrian looked at the screen. 2 of the 8 incidents, Sarah said, are not documented in any record that Crestwood should have been able to access. The Bremer contract intervention and the final phase of the Harkins neutralization, those were conducted through channels that were entirely internal to the Marlowe infrastructure. Nothing touched any external system. There's no way Crestwood obtained that documentation through surveillance of your organization or ours. So how do they have it? Lena said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had gone very flat. Someone gave it to them. Sarah looked at Lena directly. Someone with access to internal Marlowe records. Someone inside this organization. The room absorbed that. Lena stood very still. Adrian watched her process it. Watched the stillness that he now understood was not calm, but the physical expression of a mind running very fast through a very specific set of possibilities, eliminating them one by one with the precision of someone who had trained themselves to think clearly inside the worst possible moments. How many people had access to those specific records? She said. 7. In the current organization. Sarah paused. And 3 from the previous operational period. Before you withdrew. Before I withdrew. Lena's jaw tightened slightly. From 7 years ago. The access logs from that period show the Bremer documentation was reviewed twice by internal staff in the 6 months before you stepped back. One of those reviews was yours. The second, Sarah pulled up another screen, was filed under an administrative access credential belonging to your father's personal attaché, a woman named Margaret Osei, who retired when you withdrew and whose current location we do not have on file. Margaret, Lena said, and the single word carried the weight of something long and complicated. You knew her, Adrian said. She was with my father for 20 years. Lena sat down. The first time Adrian had seen her sit down without choosing to. The involuntary sitting of someone whose legs made the decision. She was at his deathbed. She helped me manage the transition when he died. A breath. I trusted her completely. She was never on my list of possible exposures. She was so far inside my blind spot I never even thought to look. She retired when you withdrew, Adrian said carefully. But she accessed the documentation before you left. She must have copied it, Sarah said. We believe she passed it to Crestwood in the period between Mr. Marlowe's death and Ms. Marlowe's withdrawal. Which means Diana had the documentation before I even met Adrian, Lena said. She's been holding it for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to file the claim. She looked at the screen. She didn't build this in response to my reemergence. She built it before I withdrew. The entire dissolution instrument was ready. She was just waiting for me to come back out. The shape of it was now fully visible, and it was worse than any of them had mapped it. Diana Voss had not reacted to Lena's return. She had created the conditions for it, waited 7 years for the moment she'd engineered, and walked a fully constructed legal instrument into the gathering secretariat. The day Lena's convoy appeared on Hargrove Avenue, every day of the last 7 years had been inside Diana's timeline. Adrian looked at Lena. She was looking at the screen, and her face had the specific quality of a person who has just understood the full depth of what they were standing in and has decided, in the same moment, not to drown in it. Margaret's location, he said to Sarah. How long to find it? We've been running it since 4 a.m. We have a probable address in Vancouver. We're 40 minutes from confirmation. When you have confirmation, I need her on a call. Not a visit, a call. She needs to understand what she's exposed to before she decides whether to talk. He looked at Lena. Will she talk to you? Lena considered it. If she understands the alternative, yes. Then we need her before 9 a.m. He looked at his watch. It was 7:10. Sarah, everything you have on the panel's evidentiary rules. If 2 of Crestwood's 8 cited incidents can be shown to have been obtained through a breach of Marlowe's own internal security, does that affect the admissibility of those incidents as evidence? Sarah was already pulling the protocols. Under Article 14, yes, evidence obtained through unauthorized access to a party's protected records is inadmissible. If we can demonstrate that the Bremer and Harkins documentation was taken without authorization, those 2 incidents are struck from the claim. And without those 2 incidents, the remaining 6 are all activities that can be demonstrated to have been protective rather than strategic. Actions taken in defense of an external party rather than in advancement of alliance interests. Sarah looked up. Without the two clean internal documents, Crestwood's case loses its evidentiary spine. The claim becomes challengeable. It becomes winnable, Adrian said. It becomes winnable, Sarah confirmed. He looked at Lena. She was already looking at him. We need Margaret, she said. We need Margaret, he agreed. And we need Diana in a room where she doesn't know the spine is gone until it's too late to rebuild it. Margaret Osei was 71 years old and living in a house in Vancouver with a garden that faced west, which meant she watched the sun go down over the water every evening, which struck Adrian when he learned this detail from Sarah as the choice of a woman who had done something she couldn't look directly at and had organized her remaining life around facing away from it. She picked up on the second ring. Lena had taken the call in the East Library, alone, and Adrian had not listened. He had stood in the hallway outside the closed door for 11 minutes, long enough to hear, through the wood, the shape of the conversation without the words. Lena's voice low and steady at first, then a silence, then something that might have been Lena responding to tears, her tone shifting into something quieter and more careful. The tone of a woman who had just learned she'd been betrayed by someone she'd loved and had decided to set that aside for now because there were more important things in the next 2 hours. When the door opened, Lena's face was composed. Her eyes were slightly brighter than normal, which was the only visible sign. She'll provide a sworn statement, Lena said. She confirms the access and the transfer. She says she believed at the time that she was acting in the Alliance's best interest, that Diana had convinced her my father's organization was going to be dismantled regardless, and that working with Crestwood was the only way to preserve parts of it. She paused. She didn't understand until years later what she had actually enabled. Will the statement hold under challenge? She's willing to appear remotely before the panel if required. She understands what she did, and she's prepared to say so in front of anyone who needs to hear it. Sarah had the statement drafted and transmitted to the Secretariat's evidence clerk by 8:15 a.m. At 8:30, they left for the gathering. The venue was a building Adrian had never entered, a private conference facility registered to a historical society, its public face entirely unremarkable, its interior a different register entirely. Dark wood, high ceilings, the accumulated gravity of a space where consequential things had been decided for a long time. They arrived together. That was not incidental. Adrian had thought about this, about the optics of their arrival, about what it communicated to the people in this room who understood the language of such things. He had asked Lena, in the car, whether she wanted to enter separately. She had looked at him for a moment and then looked back out the window and said simply, "No." They walked in together, and the room, already populated with attendees who moved through it with the careful social grammar of people who knew each other's power and were continuously calibrating, absorbed their arrival in the way these rooms absorbed everything, with perfect surface composure and complete interior attention. Adrian felt the attention. He was accustomed to being watched in rooms. He was not accustomed to being watched in this particular way, the way you're watched when the fact of your presence is itself a statement, when walking through a door beside someone is a declaration. Holt materialized at Lena's elbow and murmured something. She nodded. "Reese is confirmed on the panel," she said quietly to Adrian. "The other 4 seats are filled. The session convenes in 20 minutes. And Claire Ashton?" She was met by Marcus at the building entrance. "She's been removed from the situation." A pause. She provided 3 names in exchange for a conversation rather than an alternative. 2 of them we already had. The third is the Crestwood legal representative who filed the claim. "Is that representative here?" "Yes." Lena's eyes moved across the room with the practiced scan of someone reading a crowd for specific objects. Near the east wall, gray suit, standing alone. He knows his evidentiary spine was filed against this morning. He received the Secretariat notification at 8:42. Adrian found the man. 50s, careful posture, the face of someone doing rapid calculations. The face of someone whose position had changed in the last hour and hadn't fully decided yet how to respond. "He's going to request a recess," Adrian said. "He's going to try." "Can Reese deny it?" Under the protocols, the presiding panel member can deny a recess request if the requesting party cannot demonstrate material grounds that were unavailable at filing. Lena's voice was level. The statement from Margaret was transmitted before the session. It was available. He just chose not to account for it because he didn't know it existed. "His problem," Adrian said. His problem, she agreed. Then she went still. Not the working stillness. The other kind. The kind that meant something had changed in the room. Adrian followed her gaze. Diana Voss had walked in. She was older than the last photograph in the file. 70 now, or close to it, with white hair cut short and the kind of posture that comes not from youth but from decades of deliberate maintenance. She wore charcoal. Nothing distinctive, nothing that called attention. She was moving through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had attended many of these and knew exactly how to be unremarkable in them. She hadn't seen them yet. Adrian watched her work the room. Small nods, brief words, the social performance of an accredited attendee doing nothing unusual. She was good. Even knowing what she was, watching her move, he could see how she had stayed invisible for 15 years. Then she turned, and she saw them. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Adrian watched his aunt's face do something he had not seen a face do in a very long time. He watched it lose its arrangement. Not dramatically, not with any visible collapse. The composure didn't shatter, it simply became, for 3 seconds, insufficient to the situation, and the thing underneath it showed through. Surprise. Real surprise. And beneath that, the specific expression of someone who has run a very long and very complex operation and has arrived at the final room to find that the variables they did not account for were not peripheral, but central. She had not accounted for them together. The divorce had been the instrument precisely because it separated them. A discredited man and an isolated woman, operating independently, each with only partial information. That was the configuration the entire operation had been built to produce and to maintain through to the panel. They were standing together in a room she had spent 2 years ensuring they would never share again. Lena crossed the room. Not fast. Not dramatically. The measured pace of a woman who had decided exactly where she was going and saw no reason to hurry getting there. Adrian stayed 1 step behind her, because this was Lena's approach to make, not his. Diana watched them come. By the time they were 3 feet away, her face had reassembled itself into something functional. Not the full composure of before, but enough. The composure of a woman who had not survived 15 years as a ghost by losing her head in difficult moments. "Elena," she said. Her voice was warm, which was somehow worse than hostility would have been. "Diana," Lena said. A pause. Diana's eyes moved to Adrian. Something complicated crossed her expression. "You look like your father," she said to him. "I know," Adrian said. "He would have found this—" She paused, selecting the word. "Ironic." "He would have found it predictable," Adrian said. "He warned me about organizations that moved the board instead of playing the pieces. I didn't know at the time he was describing one his own sister built." A muscle moved in Diana's jaw. "What I built was protection, for this family, for everything your father and I inherited that you were too busy dismantling." "You faked your death," Adrian said. "You built a shadow organization using my father's connections and my wife's family's infrastructure as leverage points. You placed an asset inside my organization, engineered the collapse of my marriage, and constructed a legal instrument designed to destroy the Marlowe alliance by using evidence stolen from them 17 years ago by a woman you manipulated." He kept his voice at the same conversational level throughout. "That's not protection. That's a long grudge with good logistics." Diana looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Lena. "The statement," she said. "Margaret." "Yes," Lena said. "She loved your father." "I know. I didn't manipulate her. She believed what you needed her to believe," Lena said. "That's what manipulation is, Diana. It doesn't require force. It just requires that you understand what someone wants to be true and provide it to them." Her voice was not hard. It was something more wearing than hard. The voice of someone stating an old and painful fact. "My father trusted you. Margaret trusted you. You used both of them to build something that was never about protecting anyone except yourself." Diana looked at her for a long moment. "You don't know what I lost," Diana said. "No," Lena said. "And you don't know what I did. That was always the problem." The session bell sounded. Around them, the room began its movement toward the panel chamber. Diana stood between them and whatever she had planned for this morning, and she stood there knowing, Adrian could see the moment she completed the calculation, that the evidentiary spine was struck, that Margaret's statement was in the record, that Callum Reese was sitting on the panel, that the frame built to collapse Lena's credibility had been found and documented and would itself become evidence before the session ended. She had lost before she walked through the door. She simply hadn't known it yet. "You could leave," Lena said quietly, "before the session convenes. Whatever the panel does with the claim, your formal exposure isn't complete yet. There are proceedings that would take time. You could leave this room and I would not stop you." Adrian looked at her. Diana looked at her. "Why?" Diana said. "Because you were my father's sister," Lena said, "and because what you did came from something real, even if it became something wrong, and because I'm tired." The last sentence came out differently from the others. Not weaker, just stripped of performance. The plainly stated exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time. "I'm tired of everything in my life being a war. If you walk out, the claim fails on the evidence and it's over. If you stay," she paused, "it's also over, but it costs more." Diana looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at Adrian. Whatever she was looking for in his face, or whatever she found there, she didn't say. She turned and walked toward the building's exit. Adrian watched her go. The panel session lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. Without its evidentiary spine, the dissolution claim failed at the first substantive challenge. Reese presided with the contained efficiency of a man who had been waiting 11 years to sit in that chair again and had no intention of wasting the occasion. The Crestwood legal representative requested a recess twice and was denied twice. By the time the adjudication was formally complete, half the room already knew the outcome, and the other half had figured it out from the faces of the half that knew. Lena sat at the respondents' table through all of it, with her hands folded on the surface in front of her, and Adrian sat beside her in the seat that his father's standing entitled him to occupy, and he didn't touch her, and he didn't speak to her during the session because this was not the moment for either of those things. When the adjudication was read and the claim was formally dismissed, Lena sat still for a moment. Then she let out a breath. One breath, controlled at both ends, but real. They stood outside the building afterward in the ordinary afternoon light. The session had run past noon, and the city was going about itself with its usual indifference to the things that had been decided inside that building in the last 2 hours. Marcus was on the phone 10 feet away. Sarah's team was documenting. Holt was handling post-session filings. The machinery of the day continuing. Lena stood beside Adrian on the steps, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Diana will resurface," he said finally. "Probably. Not soon." She looked at the street. "She'll rebuild something. She's not the kind of person who stops. But Crestwood without the dissolution claim is just an organization with good logistics and a bad plan that failed. She'll have to start the architecture over." A pause. "She's 70 years old. That matters." "Will you go after her?" Lena was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Not unless she moves first. I meant what I said in there. I'm tired of everything being a war." She turned to look at him, and the afternoon light was not flattering or cinematic about it, just light on a face that had been through something real and showed it. "What happens to Claire Ashton?" "She cooperated fully. Marcus handled the terms." He paused. "She's 29. She got into something she didn't fully understand the shape of. I'm not going to destroy her for it." Lena looked at him. Something in her expression acknowledged that answer without commenting on it. "The appointment," she said. "Your father's seat. You didn't know about it." "No." "He never told you about the gathering, about any of this world?" "No." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about why. I think he knew I wouldn't have been ready to sit in it responsibly. I knew what I was when I was young, and he knew I needed to become something else first." He looked at the street. "I think he expected it to take less than 40 years. Something crossed Lena's face that might, in a different moment, have been close to a smile. "What happens now?" she said. "With the seat, with the standing?" "I'm going to learn what I should have learned a long time ago," he said. "About this world, about how it actually works." He paused. "I'll need someone who knows it to tell me what I don't know." She was quiet. "That's not why I'm asking," he said. "I want to say that clearly. I'm not asking because I need something from you operationally. I'm asking because I want to understand what your life actually is. What it's been." He looked at her. "I spent 7 years in a house with you and I didn't do that. I'm trying to do it now. The street moved around them, a delivery truck, a woman with a stroller, a man on a phone. Lena looked at all of it for a moment. It's going to take more than understanding my world, she said finally. I know. It's going to take time, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And there are going to be moments where you think you've done enough, and I'm going to tell you that you haven't. She met his eyes. I'm not going to make it easy because it wasn't easy. I'm not asking for easy. You've never had to ask for hard things before, she said. You've taken them when they were necessary. That's different from choosing them. He held her gaze. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. The full attention look, the assessment. Then she said, Coffee. There's a place 2 blocks from here. Bad lighting, good coffee, nobody who knows either of us. She started walking. We'll start there. He fell into step beside her, not behind her, not ahead, beside, which was a position he was going to have to learn the actual meaning of. And he understood that. And he was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely willing to be taught. The 12 black Rolls-Royces were not there this time. Just 2 people walking 2 blocks through an ordinary afternoon toward a table where the real conversation, not the one conducted in conference rooms and panel chambers and operations floors, but the plain, difficult, necessary one, was finally, imperfectly, about to begin.